Welcome back. Now, it's impossible to understand the recent political events in Zimbabwe without insight into the role of President Emmerson Mnangagwa. This is the view from author Ray Ndlovu, who's penned a book, In the Jaws of the Crocodile. Ndlovu draws on interviews with Mnangagwa's family and key political figures to give insight into the momentous events that changed the fate of the nation. He joins me in studio now to discuss the book. Congratulations, first of all, on actually penning this book. It's so important that we tell our stories and own the narrative. It's almost impossible to think that this happened almost a year ago. And we always joke about how clean the coup in Zimbabwe was. I'd like to focus on a chapter called The Last Supper in the book, where the Mugabes actually detailed their version of events.
Well, thank you for having me, Dudu. It's like you're saying, you know, it's a year actually next month in terms of after the fall of Robert Mugabe. And the particular chapter that you're talking about is a chapter which looks at the Mugabes saying how they never saw this coming, how really gives a sense of the detachment, as it were, of the events on the ground, how the military coalesced against them. And lo and behold, you know, they are almost unable to read the situation, and they're pushed out of power. And this is where we are now.
They never saw this coming. What were they doing at that moment when the chaos was going on?
Well, they seem to perhaps have been put in a sense of lull and comfort and thinking that, you know, they had everything under control. Remember, we had, the support that there was the support that they enjoyed from the ZANU-PF Youth League, from the Women's League, and they were seen to be very close with the police and the Central Intelligence Organization, which perhaps had given them a sense of comfort in the fact that they could, whatever could be planned, they could, still be able to retain control. But then there is a sense, even within the book itself, where I speak to some of the key figures within ZANU-PF who were their supporters, who say, you know, they never saw it coming, and they say, you know, they never saw that military element of entry into the political question that was plaguing ZANU-PF. Because remember, again, to do everything revolved around the succession question in ZANU-PF, to say, you know, who's going to be able to come into power and take over, after Robert Mugabe. And that is something that none of them could see in terms of the military being the decisive factor in that equation.
Yeah. Standing by for us to contribute to the conversation is journalist Zenzele Ndebele, who's based in Bulawayo in Zimbabwe. Zenzele, when you hear the admission from the Mugabes that this perhaps took them by surprise, are you surprised by that revelation?
No, I don't think I'm surprised, because these people thought they were, the alpha and the omega. They thought they had the power, they had the control, and they had everyone under their control. So I don't think they ever imagined that the military would turn against them, especially when Mugabe thought that these people owed him a lot from the time of the liberation, and every crime that they had done, and he had protected them. So he never thought that they were going to turn against him.
You never thought they were going to turn against him. And this book particularly looks at Emmerson Mnangagwa. You spoke to his children. He may be a lot of things to a lot of us, but to his children, he's a father, he's a great figure. Tell us about what they had to say about the man that has been termed the crocodile.
Well, they don't see him as a crocodile. I think it's everyone else, like you and I, who are outside, who are looking at this man, and, you know, we see him as an enigma, you know, as a cunning strategist, and a very patient, you know, exudes that same characteristics of a crocodile. But when I spoke to children and interviewed them in the book, you know, they simply refer to him as their dad. They don't see him as a president, you know, it's their father who they can speak to. And basically, you know, like any relationship between a father and their children, that's how they relate to him and they view him. And, you know, you get sense of, throughout the book itself, you know, they are seeing their father being subjected to ridicule last year within the political infighting in ZANU-PF, and they try to do what they can in their own power to support their father, whether it's, you know, sharing words of encouragement, you know, praying for him. And, you know, I get insights in terms of the family setup, in terms of, they pray, they have moments where they are very vulnerable, but they huddle and try to stand together in support of their father. So, you know, that's a different side of him, which we're not particularly familiar with.
And naturally you would, because, you know, it's your father. Zenzele, you hear the details about how his children describe him, but Zimbabweans see him as a different man. Ray touched on the issue of succession and how it was not there for a long time in the ZANU-PF. And he was just a man who was waiting in the wings, I guess, for the right opportunity. And the opportunity has presented itself. Who is he to Zimbabweans?
I think to Zimbabweans, Mnangagwa means a lot of things. To the people of Matabeleland, he is a killer. The person was responsible for the 50th Brigade, basically. To some in ZANU-PF, he is that patient guy who waited since 2005, way before, to actually take power. You know, in 2005, after the failure of the internal coup, which they called, the Dinyane Declaration, he was demoted and made the Minister of Rural Amenities. And, you know, so he was, you know, down and out. But he waited patiently. So, but generally, there are some people who see him as cruel, especially for the people of Matabeleland, because of the genocide that happened in Zimbabwe. They don't have kind words for him, because he has said all these things that were the problem of cockroaches and we need a DDT. Blessed are those who follow the path of ZANU-PF, because they shall have more days on earth. So we see a character of this guy who's vicious, who takes, uses power and influence to actually take control. And yet in November, many people forgot about all those things and really rallied behind him, went to Harare to march and thought that, this is the guy who has changed. And with the current economic hardships, I think people are starting to think differently. I've seen people joking that, November is around the corner. Maybe we need to actually cooperate with the military again and chase him away and all those kind of things.
Talks about what a patient man he is, which is a common theme in the book, that he's very patient, he takes his time, he doesn't raise his voice even in arguments, he's a very strategic somebody. He also touches on an important issue of Kukurahundi, and on page 179 you mentioned that sitting in his presence while you're interviewing him, I find it almost impossible to regard him as ruthless and cruel, as the man who various media reports allege was involved in the Kukurahundi massacres of the mid-1980s. What does that mean?
Well, I think when I was granted the interview to actually interview for this book, the description that Zenzele puts across is accurate in as far as, the perceptions that people have of him. And as a journalist, we write about these things. And when you meet for the first time, it was a totally different a feeling or an atmosphere, and I'm trying to describe the dissonance that I'm actually going through as a journalist and as a writer, because this is a man who I've only interacted with on the news pages and have had reports, but once you're in his presence at the time, a very accommodating man, and I describe it in detail in that chapter, is able to, crack jokes and make you feel at ease and really controls the room in that sense. And so, there's that dissonance that is there to say, I've written or read about this man, but when you are in his presence, it totally feels like it's a totally different person altogether. But that does not in any way absolve his involvement in so many of these dark past in Zimbabwean history. But while the book itself is not biographical account of him, I think I do mention and touch on the difficulties or the perceptions early on, even within the first chapter, Bulawayo itself, having been at the very heart of Kukurahundi, and that's mentioned in the very beginning of the book itself in terms of that perceptions that are there and how people view him.
What the book also attempts to look at, but we couldn't find it, is the plan in terms of the military when we talk about the coup and what the detail and the plan is. Zenzele, there are some in Zimbabwe who feel as if the military actually overtook the plan in terms of removing Robert Mugabe from power.
Yeah, you realize that before November, there was actually, the guys who had been fired, especially the war veterans, were now discussing with ZAPU, Dabengwa and the other guys to actually, take over power or start another political party, which was called the Patriotic Front. And the 18th of November was actually a date that had been set to march to Harare and declare this political party and take over. So a lot of ground had been done between the likes of Mtswangwa, the Victor Matembadanda and the other veterans, working with the ZAPU and the ZIPRA veterans. And so just 4 days before the march, before going to Harare and declare this political party, which was going to be called the Patriotic Front, the military, comes up with this plan to take over power and hand it over to Mnangagwa. And the ZAPU guys, up to now, they are bitter. They think that they were cheated again for the second time, because in 1979 they were supposed to form a patriotic front and it didn't happen. And they feel that the military actually took the plan that they already done, and they done the groundwork and everything was ready.
Ray, you also explore the relationship between Emmerson Mnangagwa and Robert Mugabe. He is someone that is revered by Mnangagwa. Tell us about that relationship.
I think from my findings when I was working on the book, he still does have respect for the former President Robert Mugabe. I think there's actually a quotation which is early on in the early chapters of the book, where he talks about his loyalty, where he says, I've always been loyal to Robert Mugabe, and I know that he knows this, and I was loyal right up until the end. And so loyalty is a very key theme within the book itself. Emmerson Mnangagwa views himself as having always been loyal, never being disobedient. But on the other hand, another key theme for me is betrayal, where the Mugabes speak about what they feel is betrayal that they endured at the hands of Emmerson Mnangagwa and Constantine Chiwenga, the former army general. So those are very two key themes, whether the people that coalesce around Mnangagwa themselves, they are fiercely loyal to him and to the cause, which they are in, and those, who ultimately fell from power feel betrayed. So you find that really constantly running throughout the book entirely.
It's interesting to see them portray themselves as victims in this whole saga. But Zenzele, I'd like to touch on an element in the book, Grace Mugabe, and her role in how everything has played itself out. There's a point in the book where you detail how Jonathan Moyo actually called Grace Mugabe when he had realized that death was beckoning him and there were soldiers outside and things were going wrong. Calling Grace Mugabe, she says he was crying at that moment. When you look at the internal divisions within ZANU-PF and how that has played itself out, what do you make of it?
I think there was a time when Jonathan was more like the de facto prime minister. He was calling the shots. He had this power. And Grace had become law unto herself. She'll go to a rally and declare that, Mr. President, choose a successor. And she even said at one point to the vice president, we can actually fire you tomorrow. And the next day, Mnangagwa was fired. So Grace was powerful at that particular time. And people like Jonathan Moyo and those who were around Mugabe thought that they actually were now, they had the power. So if they had Grace Mugabe, then by extension they had Mugabe, and they were in charge of the succession issue. So I don't think they ever imagined at one point that they will run for their dear lives and they'll be running away from the army, and even the Grace that they thought was going to help them, it was actually also under siege. So this shows how a few people in a society can control, and using especially the first lady who had been so powerful. And many a times people thought that she was actually the one who wanted to be the vice president. And even the vice president then, Zenzele Ndebele, even said, Mr. President, I'm lonely up here. Can you please appoint the successor? So the party was no longer functional. It was Grace who was calling the shots. And if Grace had said yes, then anything would go.
It gives... In politics, some would argue that it gives Game of Thrones a run for its money on its own. We could create a series in terms of what happens. But be that as it may, and as much as we can joke about it, but the reality is that today, the legacy that has been left by the likes of Robert Mugabe, his wife, and his allies, some now who are in power, is felt by ordinary Zimbabweans on the ground. Fuel shortages, money shortages, currency issues. As a Zimbabwean, outside of everything, how does that make you feel?
Well, I think you mentioned it earlier on when you spoke about, I think, a reality sort of like sinks in now. I think there was a huge expectation from November when Robert Mugabe fell, and I detail that as well in my book to say, there was a lot of expectation from so many people who hoped, there'll be jobs created, there'll be economic recovery. Almost, overnight was that kind of expectation. And a year on, people are seeing that there is hardly much improvement. In fact, many people are saying the title of the book would be more apt to describe, the economic situation that, the country finds itself in the grip and in that jaws of a crocodile in terms of, nothing is improving. There's just this standstill sort of like position that the country finds itself in. So I think there's definitely frustration that is there in regards to what was expected to take place. I think there's a lot of also expectation created by the people that came into power. They created that expectation that things are going to change. We represent a new frontier. We represent a lot of change, and it's going to almost happen overnight. And, delivery has been slow, if at all, in that respect. And I could sum it up and say to I think the smoke is clearing, and, we can see clearly now.
Yeah. Zenzele, you could be anywhere in the world. You could be like many people who have decided this is not for me, this is not conducive of an environment for me to be able to operate in. Why have you stayed?
It's always, home is always best. And I think Zimbabwe is one of the best places that you can be in terms of the opportunities, in terms of the land, in terms, it's a good place to be. And if we all run away from Zimbabwe, no one else would actually sort this out. So I think that each day we feel betrayed by the current leaders. And I always say, like Kem Sarayua said, there's nothing wrong with the Zimbabwean people, the Zimbabwean soil, the Zimbabwean climate, but there is everything wrong with the Zimbabwean leadership. And I hope in my small way, I'll contribute to making Zimbabwe a better place and actually strengthening the power of the people, because this is one of the best places in the world to be.
Thank you very much, Zenzele Ndebele. Ray, perhaps in just closing up the conversation, what you would like people to walk away knowing after having purchased this book?
Well, I think people need to start engaging more, to interrogate our leadership, to know and detail our own history, because it will help us, to understand where Zimbabwe is going to in the next 5 years. It's the first time that we are not under Robert Mugabe, who was in power for 37 years. It's a new trajectory for the country, and we need to understand the people that are in power now, and be better placed, in terms of our ability to interact with them and to be able to engage with them. So that's what I hope people take away from the book itself.
Indeed. Thank you so much for joining us. Ray Ndlovu penned the book In the Jaws of the Crocodile, Emmerson Mnangagwa's Rise to Power in Zimbabwe. Fascinating conversation. Thank you very much.